What if the most powerful chapter in the entire Bible has been hiding in plain sight, waiting for you to unlock its prophetic secrets? Matthew 6 isn't just teaching, it's a divine blueprint that exposes the exact spiritual battle you're fighting right now, whether you realize it or not. Jesus didn't randomly choose these words on that mountainside. He was unveiling 3 cosmic secrets that would determine the destiny of every person who calls themselves a believer. The hidden revolution that separates true disciples from religious actors. The prayer that holds the keys to shifting heavenly realities into earthly manifestations. And the treasure principle that will seal your fate for eternity. Right now, at this very moment, you're serving one of 2 masters, storing treasure in one of 2 locations, and building a reward in one of 2 kingdoms. And most people have chosen the wrong one without even knowing it. The religious leaders of Jesus' day missed it completely. The question is, will you? In these 34 verses lies a warning, a promise, and a revelation that could change everything about how you live your faith. What you're about to discover will either transform you or condemn you. The streets of Jerusalem during Jesus' time were filled with carefully orchestrated religious displays that had become the norm for demonstrating spiritual devotion. Every day at the appointed hours of prayer, something remarkable would happen in the synagogues and busy marketplaces. The sound of trumpets would suddenly pierce through the ambient noise of commerce and conversation. But these weren't announcements of royal proclamations or warnings of danger. They were signals that someone was about to make a charitable donation to the poor. The religious leaders had transformed acts of mercy into public spectacles. When a Pharisee or scribe decided to give alms, they ensured maximum visibility for their generosity. The trumpet blast would draw crowds, and all eyes would turn to witness the donor placing coins into the collection boxes. The amount given mattered less than who saw the giving. Each act of charity became an opportunity to build reputation and gain social standing within the religious community. Prayer had undergone a similar transformation into performance art. 3 times each day, devout Jews were expected to pray. The religious leaders took full advantage of these scheduled prayer times by positioning themselves strategically at the busiest street corners and in the most crowded areas of the temple courts. They didn't seek quiet spaces for communion with God. Instead, they wanted stages where their piety could be observed by as many people as possible. Their prayers were lengthy exhibitions of religious knowledge, filled with elaborate phrases and complex theological references. They would stand with arms raised, voices elevated, ensuring that everyone within earshot could hear their petitions to God. Passers-by would stop their activities to watch these displays, often impressed by the apparent depth of devotion they were witnessing. The content of the prayer became secondary to the performance itself. Fasting had also been absorbed into this culture of visible religiosity. When the Pharisees and scribes observed their regular fast days, they made certain that their sacrifice was publicly acknowledged. They would deliberately neglect their grooming, leaving their hair disheveled and their faces unwashed. Some would even apply ashes to their skin to create a more dramatic appearance of suffering. They walked through the streets slowly, often with exaggerated expressions of weakness, making their spiritual discipline impossible to miss. This entire system created a religious economy based on observation and reputation. Your standing in the community wasn't measured by your private relationship with God, but by how publicly religious you appeared to be. The more visible your acts of devotion, the more spiritual you were considered. The religious leaders had essentially created a performance-based spirituality where human approval became the ultimate goal, even though it was disguised as devotion to God. Against this backdrop of religious theater, Jesus stood before crowds gathered on a mountainside and spoke words that would fundamentally challenge everything they understood about practicing their faith. He wasn't offering suggestions for minor improvements to their religious system. He was about to dismantle the entire foundation upon which their spiritual lives had been built. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 1, Jesus established a principle that struck at the heart of first-century religious culture. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. These words landed like thunder on his listeners. Jesus was declaring that all the public displays of piety they had been taught to admire were actually worthless in God's eyes. The Greek word Jesus used for righteousness encompassed all acts of religious devotion, giving, praying, fasting, and any other expression of faith. He was addressing the totality of their religious practice, not just isolated actions, and his message was clear. When the motivation behind these acts was to be seen by others, when the goal was human recognition rather than genuine devotion to God, those acts earned no reward from the Father. This teaching didn't just challenge the religious leaders. It confronted every person who had been conditioned to measure their spirituality by public standards. The people listening had grown up believing that visible piety was the highest form of devotion. They had been taught that the more publicly religious you were, the more God was pleased with you. Now Jesus was telling them the opposite was true. He introduced a completely different paradigm for spiritual life. True righteousness, Jesus taught, operates in the hidden places where only God can see. The relationship between a person and their Creator wasn't meant to be performed on street corners or in synagogue courtyards. It was meant to be cultivated in private spaces, away from the evaluating eyes and applauding hands of human observers. This wasn't merely about humility, though humility was certainly involved. Jesus was redefining the entire purpose and nature of religious devotion. Acts done for God should be done to God, not displayed before people to gain their approval. The audience that mattered was an audience of one. If God saw your devotion, that was sufficient. If people saw it, that actually diminished its value. The implications of this teaching were staggering for first-century society. The religious leaders derived their power and influence from public displays of piety. Their status in the community depended on others witnessing and admiring their spiritual practices. If Jesus was right, if hidden devotion was what God valued, then the entire social structure of religious recognition collapsed. The most publicly honored religious figures might be the least recognized by God. Jesus wasn't offering a different style of practicing the same religion. He was launching a revolution that would turn their religious world upside down. He was calling his followers to a completely different way of relating to God, one that prioritized intimacy over image, authenticity over appearance, and divine approval over human applause. Having established the principle that righteousness should be practiced in secret, Jesus gave his followers specific and practical instruction about where genuine prayer should take place. In Matthew 6, verse 6, he said, "But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." The word Jesus used for room referred to a storage space that was common in first-century homes. These were small, simple closets where families kept supplies and household items. They weren't designed for comfort or meditation. They were ordinary utilitarian spaces with no religious significance whatsoever. Yet Jesus transformed this mundane closet into the most sacred space for encountering God. By directing his followers to this private room, Jesus was making prayer accessible to everyone. You didn't need access to the temple in Jerusalem. You didn't need to wait for synagogue services. You didn't need to position yourself in public spaces at appointed hours. You just needed a door you could close, removing yourself from the observation of others. The act of closing the door carried profound symbolic meaning beyond simple privacy. When you shut that door behind you, you were deliberately excluding the opinions, expectations, and judgments of other people. You were creating a space where reputation didn't matter, where performance was impossible because there was no audience to perform for. Behind that closed door, all the social pressures of religious culture fell away. In that small, hidden space, the nature of prayer changed completely. There was no need to use impressive religious vocabulary to sound spiritual. There was no pressure to pray for a certain length of time to prove your devotion. There was no competition with others to demonstrate superior piety. The pretense that characterized public prayer became not just unnecessary, but impossible in the secret place. Jesus described God as your Father, who is unseen in this passage. This phrase emphasized that God exists beyond human observation, in a realm not accessible to public scrutiny. Meeting with this unseen Father required entering into hiddenness yourself. The visible meeting the visible wasn't true spiritual communion. But when you, in your hidden place, met with the Father in his unseen realm, real intimacy became possible. This teaching revolutionized prayer by removing it from the realm of religious performance and restoring it to relationship. Prayer wasn't a ritual to be observed by others. It was conversation between a child and a father. It was meant to be personal, intimate, and honest in a way that public prayer could never be. The closed door of that small room created the conditions for this kind of authentic communion. Throughout his teaching in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus repeatedly emphasized one crucial aspect of God's character that his listeners needed to understand. God sees what happens in the hidden places. This wasn't mentioned casually or in passing. Jesus returned to this theme again and again because it formed the foundation for everything else he was teaching about secret devotion. The phrase, "Your Father who sees what is done in secret," appears multiple times in this chapter, creating a rhythm that reinforced the message. When you give to the needy in secret, your Father sees. When you pray behind closed doors, your Father sees. When you fast without making it known to others, your Father sees. Nothing escapes his notice. No act of hidden devotion goes unobserved by him. This revelation about God's character directly contradicted the assumptions underlying public religious performance. The religious leaders operated on the belief that if people didn't see your righteousness, it didn't count for much. They acted as though God needed human witnesses to validate spiritual activity. Their entire system was built on visibility because they couldn't trust in a God who saw what remained hidden from human eyes. But Jesus presented a completely different picture of God. He wasn't describing a distant deity who needed to be informed about human activities or convinced to pay attention. He was revealing a Father whose gaze penetrates every hidden space, who notices every private prayer, who values every secret act of worship. God's awareness wasn't limited to what happened in public spaces. In fact, he seemed particularly attentive to what happened when no one else was watching. The way Jesus framed this truth was important. He didn't present God's ability to see in secret as surveillance or as an invasive monitoring of people's private moments. The context was always that of a loving father watching his children with care and attention. This was the gaze of someone who cared deeply, who noticed what others overlooked, who valued the genuine over the performative. When Jesus said the Father sees what is done in secret, he used a Greek word that implied more than just visual observation. It carried connotations of understanding, knowing, and perceiving not just the action, but the motivation behind it. God didn't just see the external act of giving or praying or fasting. He saw the heart condition that produced those acts. He discerned the difference between genuine devotion and religious show. This meant that believers could trust their hidden acts of righteousness to God's notice. They didn't need human witnesses to validate their spiritual lives. They didn't need applause to confirm that their devotion mattered. The Father's observation was sufficient. His notice was the only validation they required. Jesus didn't soften his words when he addressed those who practiced their righteousness to be seen by others. He called them exactly what they were, hypocrites. This word, borrowed from Greek theater, referred to actors who wore masks and played roles on stage. These people weren't living authentic spiritual lives. They were performing religion, playing the part of devout believers while their hearts remained far from God. In Matthew 6, verse 2, Jesus described their approach to charitable giving with vivid detail. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. The trumpet announcement wasn't metaphorical. Religious leaders actually did use trumpets to draw attention to their charitable donations, turning acts of mercy into public spectacles. The phrase Jesus used, "They have received their reward in full," carried specific weight that his original audience would have immediately recognized. This was commercial language, the exact phrasing used in business transactions when a debt had been completely paid off. When a merchant stamped a bill with this phrase, it meant the account was settled. There was nothing more owed, nothing more to be given, nothing more to be received. Jesus was delivering a devastating verdict. The hypocrites who practiced their giving to be seen by others had already received everything they would ever get from those acts. The admiration they heard, the honor they received, the reputation they built in their communities. That was it. That was their complete and final payment. There would be no heavenly recognition waiting for them. There would be no divine reward stored up in eternity. The same principle applied to their public prayers. In verse 5, Jesus said, "And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full." They loved to be seen praying. That was their motivation. They positioned themselves where crowds would notice them, and they got what they wanted. People saw them and thought they were devout. But that admiration was all they would ever receive. Jesus addressed their fasting with the same sharp clarity. In verse 16, he stated, "When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full." 3 times in this chapter, Jesus pronounced this judgment. 3 times he declared that their reward was already paid in full. After exposing the emptiness of hypocritical giving, Jesus presented a radically different approach to charity. He transformed giving from a public transaction that built social capital into a sacred secret between the giver and God. In Matthew 6, verses 3 and 4, he gave instructions that seemed almost impossible to follow. "But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you." The image Jesus painted was deliberately absurd. How could your left hand not know what your right hand was doing? Both hands are connected to the same body, controlled by the same brain, guided by the same consciousness. The impossibility of this instruction was precisely the point Jesus was making. Your giving should be so completely private, so thoroughly without announcement or self-congratulation, that even you almost forget about it. This teaching completely reframed the purpose of helping the poor. In the public giving model, the poor person was almost a prop in the giver's performance. They provided the opportunity for the wealthy person to display generosity to an audience. But in Jesus' model, the poor person's need was met as part of an act of worship directed toward God. The primary relationship wasn't between giver and recipient observed by crowds. It was between the giver and God, with the recipient blessed as a result. The secret nature of this giving actually purified the motivation behind it. When no one knew about your generosity except God, there was no possibility of mixed motives. You couldn't be seeking praise because no one would know to praise you. You couldn't be building a reputation for generosity because the gifts remained anonymous. The only possible reason for giving in this way was genuine care for the poor, combined with devotion to God. When Jesus addressed prayer, he systematically removed every element that turned communication with God into a religious performance. He had already instructed his followers to pray in private, behind closed doors. Now he addressed the content and style of prayer itself, correcting distortions that had crept into how people approached God. In Matthew 6, verses 7 and 8, Jesus gave clear guidance. "And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him." The pagans Jesus referenced believed their gods were distant and inattentive, requiring lengthy petitions and repeated requests to finally gain their notice and favor. These pagan prayers often consisted of strings of divine names and titles, extensive descriptions of the gods' supposed attributes, and repetitive phrases designed to wear down divine resistance. The underlying assumption was that the gods either didn't know about human needs or didn't care enough to address them without being pressured through verbal persistence. Jesus rejected this entire approach. He revealed that God doesn't need to be informed about situations because he already knows what his children need before they ask. Prayer isn't about giving God information he lacks or convincing him to care about problems he's ignoring. The Father is already aware. He's already concerned. This revelation transformed the purpose of prayer from persuasion to relationship. You don't pray to change God's mind or to make him pay attention. You pray to express your dependence on him, to maintain intimate communication with him, to align your heart with his will. Through all his teaching about secret devotion in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus was establishing something far more significant than guidelines for religious practice. He was revealing the source of authentic spiritual power and authority in his kingdom. The principle he established would determine who could effectively serve God and who would remain spiritually impotent despite outward religious activity. The religious leaders of Jesus' day had built impressive public reputations. They were recognized as spiritual authorities. People sought their advice and deferred to their religious knowledge. Yet Jesus revealed that their public prominence masked spiritual bankruptcy. Meanwhile, there were others, people whose names weren't known to the crowds, who held no official religious positions, who possessed genuine spiritual authority. When they prayed, circumstances changed. Their power didn't flow from public recognition. It flowed from what happened in the hidden places. Jesus was teaching his disciples that the secret place was the source of kingdom effectiveness. What you did behind closed doors, in those private moments with God that no one else witnessed, determined what you could accomplish in public ministry. The depth of your relationship with the Father in hiddenness directly correlated to the power that would flow through your life in visibility. The principle worked in reverse as well. People who built their entire spiritual identity on public recognition found themselves powerless when faced with real spiritual challenges. They could quote scripture impressively and perform religious rituals flawlessly, but they couldn't cast out demons, couldn't heal the sick, couldn't pray prayers that moved God's heart and hand. The secret place became the training ground for kingdom ministry. Every moment spent in that closed room with the Father, every private prayer offered without human witnesses, every act of secret devotion done only for God's eyes. These built spiritual muscle and developed authentic authority. The disciples had been watching Jesus for some time now, observing patterns in his life that connected directly to the extraordinary power flowing through his ministry. They noticed that he would often disappear before dawn, slipping away to isolated places while everyone else still slept. They had seen him spend entire nights alone, communing with the Father under the stars. And they couldn't help but recognize the relationship between these private prayer sessions and the authority that marked everything Jesus did. His prayers weren't like the prayers they had heard all their lives in the synagogues. When the scribes and Pharisees prayed, their words were impressive, but seemed to accomplish little beyond building their reputations. When Jesus prayed, things happened. Sick people were healed. Demons fled. Storms stopped. The very atmosphere seemed to shift when he spoke to the Father. The disciples wanted access to whatever Jesus had discovered in prayer. They wanted to pray in a way that actually reached heaven and brought results on earth. They recognized their own inadequacy. The religious training they had received, the prayer formulas they had memorized, the techniques they had been taught, none of it seemed to produce what they witnessed in Jesus' life. So they came to him with a simple but profound request. They didn't ask him to teach them how to preach better sermons or perform more impressive miracles. They asked him to teach them how to pray. This request acknowledged that everything else in Jesus' ministry flowed from his prayer life. If they could learn to pray the way he prayed, perhaps they could access the same power, the same intimacy with the Father, the same effectiveness in serving God's purposes. Jesus responded to their request by giving them what would become the most famous prayer in human history. But he wasn't just handing them words to repeat. He was giving them a template that would reshape how they understood God, how they approached him, and what they should prioritize when they prayed. Jesus began his model prayer with 2 words that would completely revolutionize how his followers understood their relationship with God. In Matthew 6, verse 9, he instructed them, "This then is how you should pray, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name." The prayer started with Our Father, and these opening words carried more weight than his disciples initially realized. In the religious culture of first-century Judaism, people didn't casually refer to God as Father. The prevailing image of God was that of a distant king, a fearsome judge, a powerful master who demanded strict obedience. People approached him with trembling and formality. The gap between humanity and divinity seemed impossibly wide, bridged only through complex religious rituals and the mediation of priests. But Jesus invited his followers to address the creator of the universe as Father. Not just any father, but specifically using a term that implied intimacy and relationship. This wasn't the formal address you would use for a distant authority figure. This was the word a child would use when approaching a parent they trusted completely. The word "our" at the beginning of the prayer was equally significant. Jesus didn't say, "My Father," as if this relationship was his alone. He said, "Our Father," indicating that his followers could share in this same intimate connection with God. The Father who loved Jesus, who listened to Jesus, who delighted in Jesus, this same Father was available to them. This opening completely redefined prayer. It wasn't a servant fearfully approaching an unpredictable master. It wasn't a subject petitioning a distant king who might or might not grant an audience. It was a child talking to a father who loved them, who wanted to hear from them, who was already inclined toward them with affection and care. Jesus added "in heaven" to clarify that this Father, while intimately accessible, was still the sovereign God who ruled over all creation. The intimacy didn't diminish his majesty. The closeness didn't reduce his power. He was both perfectly approachable and infinitely worthy of reverence. Immediately after establishing this intimate address of Our Father, Jesus taught his disciples where their prayers should begin. In that same verse, Matthew 6:9, he continued, "Hallowed be your name." Before asking for anything personal, before presenting any needs or requests, the prayer focused entirely on God's reputation and honor. The word "hallowed" meant to be made holy, to be treated as sacred, to be honored and revered. Jesus was teaching his followers that their first concern in prayer shouldn't be their own circumstances or desires. It should be that God's name, his character, his reputation, his glory would be honored and recognized as holy throughout the earth. This request revealed a startling priority. Most people came to prayer thinking primarily about what they needed from God. They had problems to solve, needs to meet, circumstances to change. But Jesus was teaching a different approach. The first words out of their mouths should express concern for God's glory, not their own comfort. When you pray, "Hallowed be your name," you're asking that God would be recognized and honored for who he truly is. You're requesting that his character would be revealed to people who don't know him. You're expressing desire that his reputation would be defended against those who slander or misrepresent him. You're prioritizing his glory above everything else, including your own immediate needs. This petition also represented a surrender of sorts. By starting with concern for God's name being hallowed, you were acknowledging that his honor mattered more than your personal agenda. You were submitting your prayer list to a higher priority, the advancement of God's reputation in the world. Jesus was teaching that when you get this priority right, when God's glory becomes your first concern, everything else in prayer falls into proper perspective. Your requests don't disappear, but they become aligned with his purposes rather than driven solely by your preferences. After addressing God's name and reputation, Jesus moved to the next petition in the prayer. In Matthew 6, verse 10, he taught them to pray, "Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." The first part of this request, "Your kingdom come," was a prayer for heaven to invade earth, for God's rule to be established in places where it was currently resisted or ignored. A kingdom exists wherever a king's authority is recognized and obeyed. In heaven, God's authority is perfectly acknowledged. Angels obey him instantly. His will is done without question or resistance. But on earth, the situation was drastically different. Rebellion against God was the norm. His authority was rejected. His ways were ignored or actively opposed. When Jesus taught his disciples to pray, "Your kingdom come," he was instructing them to ask for earth to become like heaven in its submission to God's rule. This was a prayer for God's authority to be established, for his ways to be embraced, for his rule to extend into every corner of human existence where it was currently rejected. This petition carried revolutionary implications. It meant praying for God's kingdom to invade governments that operated by corrupt principles. It meant asking for his rule to transform societies built on injustice. It meant requesting that his authority would break into individual lives that were living in rebellion against him. It was a prayer for comprehensive change, for the reordering of reality according to heaven's pattern. The request wasn't passive or theoretical. When you prayed, "Your kingdom come," you were asking God to act, to intervene, to assert his authority in the world. You were inviting him to break into human history and establish his reign wherever it was currently absent. This was a bold prayer that expected God to move in power. Jesus was also teaching his followers that they should care deeply about God's kingdom advancing. Their prayers shouldn't be entirely consumed with personal matters. They should be concerned with the bigger picture of God's purposes being accomplished in the world. The second part of Matthew 6, verse 10, took the previous petition deeper. "Your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." This request moved from the general idea of God's kingdom coming to the specific reality of his will being accomplished. In heaven, God's will is done perfectly, completely, and immediately. Jesus was teaching his disciples to pray for that same perfect obedience to characterize life on earth. This petition required profound trust. When you pray, "Your will be done," you're surrendering your own plans and preferences to God's superior wisdom and purposes. You're acknowledging that his will might differ from your desires, and you're choosing his way even before you know what it might cost you. Many people struggle with this prayer because they fear God's will might be harsh or unpleasant. They imagine that surrendering to his will means accepting misery or loss, but Jesus was teaching them to see it differently. God's will, properly understood, is always best. It flows from his perfect love and infinite wisdom. When his will is done on earth as perfectly as it's done in heaven, the result is always what's truly good. The phrase, "on earth as it is in heaven," set the standard. In heaven, God's will isn't done reluctantly or partially. It's embraced fully and joyfully. Angels don't obey God because they have no other choice. They obey because they see clearly that his will is perfect. Jesus was teaching his followers to pray for that same wholehearted embrace of God's will to characterize their lives on earth. This prayer also implied action. You couldn't pray, "Your will be done," while actively resisting what you knew God wanted from you. The prayer required personal surrender, as well as asking for God's will to be accomplished in the broader world. It meant offering yourself as an instrument through which his will could be done on earth. There was freedom in this surrender. When you genuinely prayed for God's will to be done and meant it, you were released from the burden of controlling outcomes. You could trust that God was working all things according to his purposes, even when circumstances didn't make sense to you. After teaching his disciples to prioritize God's glory, kingdom, and will, Jesus finally addressed personal needs. In Matthew 6, verse 11, he instructed them to pray, "Give us today our daily bread." This simple request carried layers of meaning that challenged how his followers thought about provision and trust. The specificity of daily bread was intentional. Jesus wasn't teaching them to pray for a warehouse full of supplies that would last for years. He was teaching them to ask for what they needed for today. This request echoed the way God provided manna for Israel in the wilderness, enough for each day, requiring them to trust him again tomorrow for tomorrow's provision. By teaching this prayer, Jesus was addressing the human tendency toward anxiety about the future. People wanted security. They wanted guarantees. They wanted to know that their needs would be met not just today, but for all their tomorrows. But Jesus was teaching a different approach. Trust God for today's provision and trust him again tomorrow when tomorrow comes. The word bread represented all necessary provisions, not just literal food. It included everything required for life and sustenance. When you prayed, "Give us today our daily bread," you were asking God to provide what you genuinely needed for this day. Not what you wanted or desired, but what you actually needed. This prayer required humility. It meant acknowledging that you were dependent on God's provision. You couldn't sustain yourself through your own power or cleverness. Every day, you needed him to supply what was necessary for your life. This dependence wasn't weakness. It was the recognition of reality. Jesus was also teaching his followers to distinguish between needs and wants. Daily bread covered necessities, not luxuries. When you prayed this prayer, you were asking God to meet your actual needs, while trusting him with the wisdom to know what those needs truly were. The plural us instead of me reminded his disciples that they were part of a community. They should pray not just for their own provision, but for the provision of their brothers and sisters in the faith. This prayer wasn't selfish. It included concern for others who also needed God's supply. Jesus moved to what might be the most challenging petition in the entire prayer. In Matthew 6, verse 12, he taught them to pray, "And forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors." This request introduced a dangerous element of reciprocity into prayer. You were asking God to forgive you in the same manner and to the same degree that you forgave others. The term debts referred to sins and offenses, ways that people had fallen short of what they owed to God and to each other. Every person carried a debt of sin before God that they couldn't pay. They needed his forgiveness to be released from the guilt and consequences of their failures. This petition acknowledged that reality and asked for God's mercy. But the request didn't stop with asking for forgiveness. It included a comparison, "as we also have forgiven our debtors." Jesus was teaching his disciples to ask God to forgive them in the same way they forgave others. If they forgave completely, they could ask for complete forgiveness. If they forgave reluctantly or partially, they were asking God to forgive them reluctantly or partially. This wasn't a works-based system where you earned God's forgiveness by forgiving others. It was a heart issue. Jesus was revealing that you couldn't genuinely receive God's forgiveness while harboring unforgiveness toward others. The two were incompatible. If you truly understood the magnitude of your debt before God and how freely He had forgiven you, you couldn't withhold forgiveness from others who had wronged you. The danger of this prayer was real. Every time you prayed it, you were inviting God to treat you exactly as you treated those who had sinned against you. If you held grudges, if you refused to forgive, if you kept score of offenses, you were literally asking God to do the same to you. This petition forced you to examine your own heart regarding forgiveness every time you prayed. Jesus emphasized this point immediately after giving them the prayer. In Matthew 6 verses 14 and 15, He explained, "For if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins." The connection was direct and unavoidable. Your forgiveness of others was linked to God's forgiveness of you. This teaching challenged the human tendency to categorize sins, thinking some offenses were forgivable, while others weren't. It confronted the desire to hold on to bitterness and resentment. It demanded that followers of Jesus extend the same mercy they had received from God. Jesus concluded the prayer with a request that acknowledged the reality of spiritual warfare. In Matthew 6 verse 13, He taught them to pray, "And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one." This final petition recognized that His followers lived in enemy territory, facing real spiritual dangers that required God's protection and guidance. The first part, "lead us not into temptation," wasn't suggesting that God would deliberately lead people into situations designed to make them sin. James 1:13 clarifies that God doesn't tempt anyone to do evil. Rather, this was a request that God would guide His followers away from situations where they would face overwhelming temptation. It was asking for divine wisdom to avoid circumstances where their weaknesses would be exploited. This petition acknowledged human vulnerability. It was a humble admission that you knew your own weaknesses and limitations. You understood that certain situations could overwhelm your resistance, so you were asking God to guide your path away from those dangers, to protect you from being placed in circumstances where you would likely fail. The second part of the request, "Deliver us from the evil one," was even more direct. Jesus was teaching His disciples to pray for deliverance from Satan himself, the personal enemy who sought to destroy God's people. This wasn't paranoia or superstition. It was recognition of biblical reality. There was a spiritual adversary who opposed God's purposes and attacked God's people. By including this petition in the model prayer, Jesus was teaching that spiritual warfare was a normal part of Christian life, not an exceptional circumstance. Every believer needed to regularly pray for protection from the evil one's schemes and attacks. This wasn't optional or only for certain super-spiritual individuals. It was essential for everyone who followed Jesus. The request for deliverance implied that without God's intervention, His followers were vulnerable to the evil one's attacks. They needed divine protection and rescue. They couldn't defend themselves through their own strength or wisdom. This prayer expressed dependence on God's power to overcome spiritual enemies. Jesus was teaching His disciples to take spiritual opposition seriously while trusting in God's superior power. They should be aware of the enemy without being paralyzed by fear. They should recognize the reality of spiritual warfare while resting in the security of their Father's protection. The prayer acknowledged danger while expressing confidence in God's ability to deliver them from it. After teaching his disciples how to pray, Jesus shifted to address something that would reveal the true condition of their hearts, where they chose to store their wealth. This wasn't casual financial advice. Jesus was about to expose a spiritual principle that would determine the entire trajectory of their lives and their eternal destiny. In Matthew 6, verse 19, Jesus posed a direct challenge to his listeners. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. He wasn't starting with suggestions or recommendations. He began with a clear command about what not to do. His followers were not to accumulate treasure on earth as their primary focus or ultimate goal. The phrase, "store up for yourselves," revealed the heart issue Jesus was addressing. This wasn't about having possessions or earning money. It was about accumulation as a life strategy, about building wealth as your central pursuit, about making earthly treasure the thing you lived for. Jesus was confronting the human tendency to find security and significance in material accumulation. Every person stores treasure somewhere. Everyone invests their time, energy, and resources into something they consider valuable. The question isn't whether you'll accumulate treasure, but where you'll choose to store it. Jesus was forcing his listeners to make a deliberate choice about the location of their investment. This teaching hit directly at the cultural values of both first-century society and every society since. Wealth accumulation was considered a sign of God's blessing, a measure of success, a source of security. People worked their entire lives to build estates they could pass to their children. They measured their worth by the size of their holdings. They found their identity in their financial status, but Jesus was about to reveal that this entire approach was fundamentally flawed. The location where you stored your treasure wasn't just a financial decision. It was a spiritual decision with eternal consequences. Where you put your treasure would determine where your heart would go, what your life would be about, and ultimately what would happen to you after death. Jesus didn't leave his warning about earthly treasure as an abstract principle. He got specific about why storing treasure on earth was a terrible strategy. In that same verse, Matthew 6:19, he described the inevitable fate of earthly wealth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. Moths represented the destructive forces that attack valuable fabrics and clothing. In the ancient world, fine garments were a significant form of wealth. People stored expensive robes and fabrics as investments. But moths would get into storage areas and destroy these valuable items, eating holes through material that had taken months or years to acquire. Your wealth could literally be consumed by tiny insects you couldn't even see working in the darkness. Rust or corrosion attacked metals and other materials that people considered permanent. You might accumulate gold, silver, or bronze objects thinking they would last forever. But even metals deteriorate over time. Rust eats away at iron. Corrosion damages precious metals. The things you thought were indestructible slowly break down, losing their value and eventually becoming worthless. Thieves represented the human threat to accumulated wealth. No matter how securely you tried to protect your earthly treasure, someone could break in and steal it. You could build strong houses with thick walls, but thieves would find ways to dig through those walls. You could hide your valuables in secret places, but clever thieves would discover them. No earthly security system was foolproof. Jesus was revealing a fundamental truth about earthly treasure. It's all temporary and vulnerable. Every form of wealth you could accumulate on earth faced guaranteed loss through one mechanism or another. The question wasn't if you would lose it, but how and when. Moths, rust, thieves, natural disasters, economic collapse, death, something would eventually separate you from every earthly possession you accumulated. This wasn't pessimism, it was realism. Jesus was telling his followers to face facts about the nature of earthly wealth. If you invested your life in accumulating things that were guaranteed to be destroyed or stolen, you were making a terrible investment decision. You were working hard to build something that would inevitably be lost. The certainty of loss made earthly treasure accumulation not just unwise, but foolish. It was like building a house on sand right at the water's edge and expecting it to stand forever. The destruction wasn't a possibility, it was an absolute certainty. Every earthly treasure would eventually be consumed, corroded, or stolen. Having exposed the foolishness of storing treasure on earth, Jesus immediately presented the alternative. In Matthew 6, verse 20, he instructed his followers, "But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal." There was a place where treasure could be stored safely, where it would never be lost or diminished. Heaven was completely different from earth in terms of treasure storage. The destructive forces that plagued earthly wealth had no access to heavenly treasure. Moths couldn't reach heaven to destroy what was stored there. Rust and corrosion had no effect on heavenly riches. Thieves couldn't break into heaven's storehouses to steal what belonged to God's children. Jesus was teaching that you could make investments that would last forever. You could store up wealth that would never lose its value, never be taken from you, never deteriorate or disappear. But this required a completely different approach to how you used your resources while on earth. Storing treasure in heaven meant using your earthly resources in ways that had eternal value. When you gave to the poor, you were transferring wealth from earth to heaven. When you invested in advancing God's kingdom, you were making deposits in your heavenly account. When you used your money and possessions to serve others and glorify God, rather than building your own earthly empire, you were accumulating treasure that would last forever. This wasn't about earning your way into heaven or buying God's favor. It was about choosing to invest in what truly mattered, what would outlast your earthly life. You were going to invest your resources somewhere. Jesus was teaching you to invest them in a place where they would actually be safe and where they would continue to have value after you died. The security of heavenly treasure was absolute. Nothing could threaten it. No economic downturn could diminish it. No disaster could destroy it. No thief could access it. No passage of time could erode it. What you stored in heaven was permanently secure, guaranteed by God Himself to be waiting for you when you arrived. Jesus was offering His followers a choice between two investment strategies. They could invest in temporary earthly wealth that was guaranteed to be lost, or they could invest in permanent heavenly treasure that was guaranteed to last forever. The wise choice was obvious when stated so clearly. After presenting the contrast between earthly and heavenly treasure, Jesus revealed a principle that explained why this choice mattered so much. In Matthew 6, verse 21, He stated, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." This wasn't the way most people thought about the relationship between treasure and heart. People typically believed their heart determined where they put their treasure. They thought they invested in things they cared about. But Jesus revealed that the causation ran in the opposite direction. Where you put your treasure determines where your heart will go. Your investment decisions don't follow your heart. Your heart follows your investment decisions. This was revolutionary insight into how human psychology works. When you invest significant resources into something, your heart becomes attached to it. You start caring about it deeply because you have something invested in it. Your attention goes to where your treasure is. Your thoughts return constantly to whatever you've invested in. Your emotions become tied to its success or failure. If you stored your treasure on earth, if you invested your time, energy, and resources primarily in accumulating earthly wealth and possessions, your heart would inevitably be pulled toward earthly things. You would find yourself constantly thinking about money, worrying about your possessions, checking the value of your investments, comparing yourself to others based on material wealth. Your heart would be anchored to earth. But if you stored your treasure in heaven, if you invested your resources in eternal things, in serving God and loving people, your heart would be drawn toward heaven. You would find yourself thinking about eternal matters. You would care about things that had lasting value. Your priorities would shift toward what mattered to God. Your heart would be anchored to heaven. Jesus was teaching that you could control the direction of your heart by controlling where you put your treasure. This gave his followers tremendous power. If you wanted your heart to be focused on heaven, focused on God, free from obsession with earthly things, the path was clear. Store your treasure in heaven. Your heart would follow. This also explained why accumulating earthly wealth was so spiritually dangerous. It wasn't that money itself was evil. The danger was that wherever you put your treasure, your heart would go there too. If your treasure was on earth, your heart would be earthbound. You would lose interest in spiritual things. You would become preoccupied with temporal concerns. Your affections would be captured by things that were passing away. The principle worked automatically. You didn't have to consciously decide to care about where your treasure was. It happened naturally. Your heart was magnetically drawn to whatever you had invested in most heavily. This made your financial decisions into spiritual decisions with profound consequences for your soul. Jesus shifted metaphors to explain another dimension of how treasure affected a person's entire life. In Matthew 6, verses 22 and 23, he taught, "The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness?" The eye functioned as the lamp that brought light into the body. In ancient understanding, the eye wasn't just a passive receiver of images. It was thought to be the source that illuminated what a person saw and understood. If your eye was healthy and functioning properly, light would fill your whole being. You would see clearly. You would perceive reality accurately. Your entire life would be illuminated by truth. But if your eye was unhealthy, if your vision was distorted or corrupted, then your whole body would be full of darkness. You would stumble around in confusion. You would misperceive reality. You would make decisions based on false understanding. Your entire life would be characterized by spiritual darkness and confusion. Jesus was using the eye as a metaphor for spiritual perspective and focus. The healthy eye represented a person who saw things from God's perspective, who had their priorities straight, who recognized what truly mattered. This person could see clearly the difference between temporary and eternal, between valuable and worthless, between truth and deception. The unhealthy eye represented distorted spiritual vision. This was a person who saw everything wrong, who valued what was worthless and ignored what was precious, who couldn't distinguish between temporary pleasures and eternal realities. Their entire perspective on life was corrupted. The connection to the treasure teaching was direct. If your treasure was in heaven, your eye would be healthy. You would see clearly because your perspective was aligned with eternal reality. But if your treasure was on earth, your eye would be unhealthy. You would see everything through the distorted lens of temporal values, unable to perceive spiritual truth accurately. Jesus warned about the consequences of spiritual blindness. If the light within you, your ability to perceive truth, was actually darkness, how great was that darkness? When you thought you were seeing clearly but were actually blind, when you believed you were walking in wisdom but were actually stumbling in confusion, the resulting darkness was profound and dangerous. This teaching revealed that where you stored your treasure affected not just your heart, but your entire perception of reality. Your financial decisions influenced your spiritual vision. If you invested in earthly treasure, you would gradually lose the ability to see spiritual truth clearly. Your perspective would become increasingly distorted until you were walking in complete darkness while believing you were in the light. Jesus continued to press his point about treasure and loyalty by introducing the concept of masters and servants. In Matthew 6, verse 24, he made a declaration about divided loyalty. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. This wasn't a suggestion or a warning, it was a statement of impossibility. The word serve implied complete devotion and obedience. A servant belonged entirely to their master. They existed to fulfill their master's will, to advance their master's interests, to obey their master's commands. A servant's life was defined by their relationship to their master. Jesus declared that having two masters was logically impossible. You couldn't give complete devotion to two different authorities with potentially conflicting demands. When their commands contradicted each other, you would have to choose which one to obey. That choice would reveal who your real master was. The language Jesus used was strong. He didn't say you would prefer one master while tolerating the other. He said you would love one and hate the other, be devoted to one and despise the other. These were extreme terms that revealed the intensity of the division that occurs when you try to serve two masters. Human nature doesn't allow for divided ultimate loyalty. You might think you can balance multiple allegiances, giving each master partial devotion. But when forced to choose, and you will be forced to choose, you will discover that one master actually owns your heart, while the other doesn't. One commands your true allegiance, while the other receives only your leftover attention. This principle applied to every area of life, but Jesus was about to make a specific application to the treasure teaching he had been developing. The impossibility of serving two masters would explain why you couldn't pursue both earthly treasure and heavenly treasure with equal devotion. You had to choose which master would command your ultimate loyalty. Having established that serving two masters was impossible, Jesus identified the two specific masters competing for his followers' devotion. In the second half of Matthew 6, verse 24, he made it explicit: you cannot serve both God and money. Indeed, this wasn't one example among many possible master conflicts. This was the fundamental competition at the heart of human existence. Money represented more than just currency or material possessions. In the original language, Jesus used the word mammon, which personified wealth as a spiritual force demanding allegiance. Money wasn't just a tool or a resource. It functioned as an alternative god, a rival power seeking to rule people's hearts and lives. Jesus declared direct opposition between God and money. They weren't complementary forces that could be balanced or harmonized. They were competing masters, each demanding total allegiance, each requiring complete devotion. You had to choose which one you would serve. This choice determined everything about your life. If you chose to serve God, you would use money as a tool to advance his purposes. Money would be your servant, not your master. You would make financial decisions based on kingdom priorities. You would hold your possessions loosely, ready to release them whenever God directed. Your security would rest in God, not in your bank account. But if you chose to serve money, God would be pushed to the margins of your life. You might still claim to believe in him, still attend religious services, still maintain a religious identity. But your actual decisions would be driven by financial considerations. When God's will conflicted with financial advantage, you would choose money. Your real trust would be in your wealth, not in God. Jesus was forcing a decision. His followers couldn't drift along trying to serve both masters. They couldn't compartmentalize their lives, giving God authority over spiritual matters while letting money rule their practical decisions. The masters were in competition, and only one could win. The way you handled money revealed which master you had chosen. If you stored treasure on earth, hoarded wealth, made decisions based primarily on financial considerations, and found your security in material possessions, you had chosen to serve money even if you claimed to serve God. But if you stored treasure in heaven, used your resources to advance God's kingdom, and found your security in Him rather than your wealth, you had chosen to serve God. Jesus concluded his teaching on treasure by connecting it to the issue of anxiety. In Matthew 6, verse 25, he transitioned to this application. Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? The word, therefore, indicated that this teaching about anxiety flowed directly from what he had just said about treasure and masters. If you had truly stored your treasure in heaven and chosen God as your master, anxiety about earthly provisions would be unnecessary and inappropriate. Worry about food, drink, and clothing revealed that your treasure was still on earth, that you were still serving money rather than God. Your anxiety exposed where your real trust was placed. Jesus questioned the logic of anxiety about basic provisions. Life was more than food, and the body was more than clothes. God had already given you the greater gifts of life and body. Would He withhold the lesser provisions of food and clothing? If He created you and sustained your existence, could He not be trusted to provide what that existence required? The command, "Do not worry," wasn't a suggestion to try your best not to be anxious. It was a prohibition based on who God was and what He had already demonstrated about His character. Worry about provisions was actually an insult to God's faithfulness. It suggested that He who gave you life couldn't be trusted to sustain that life with what it needed. Jesus continued in verses 26 through 30 with examples from nature that reinforced His point. He directed His listeners to observe the birds. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Birds didn't worry about their next meal, didn't store up food in barns, didn't experience anxiety about provisions. Yet God fed them daily. If God cared for birds, how much more would He care for humans who were far more valuable to Him? Then Jesus pointed to the flowers. And why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will He not much more clothe you, you of little faith? Wildflowers that would only exist for a brief time were clothed by God in beauty that exceeded King Solomon's royal robes. If God beautified temporary grass, would He not provide clothing for His children? Jesus identified anxiety about provisions as evidence of little faith. When you worried about food and clothing, you were revealing that your faith in God's care was weak. You were demonstrating that you didn't really trust Him to provide what you needed. Your anxiety exposed the true state of your heart. In verses 31 and 32, Jesus contrasted His followers with unbelievers. So do not worry, saying, "What shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear?" For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. The pagans, those who didn't know God, ran after earthly provisions because they had no heavenly Father to trust. But Jesus' followers did have a Father who knew their needs. Their anxiety about provisions made them look just like people who had no God to trust. Jesus concluded this section in verse 33 with the proper priority. But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. This brought the entire treasure teaching full circle. Instead of storing treasure on earth and worrying about earthly provisions, His followers should prioritize God's kingdom and righteousness. When they got their priorities right, when they stored treasure in heaven and served God rather than money, God would take responsibility for providing their earthly needs. The final verse of the chapter, verse 34, gave one more instruction about anxiety. Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Jesus taught his followers to live one day at a time, trusting God for today's provisions and trusting him again tomorrow for tomorrow's needs. This echoed the daily bread petition from the prayer he had taught them earlier in the chapter. Anxiety about the future revealed that you were still trying to store up earthly treasure, still trying to secure your own future through material accumulation, still serving money rather than God. But when you truly stored treasure in heaven and served God as your master, you could rest in his faithful care for both today and tomorrow. If this message has challenged you, convicted you, or opened your eyes to spiritual realities you've been ignoring, don't let this moment pass without action. Share this video with someone who needs to hear these truths. Subscribe to this channel so you can continue growing in your understanding of God's Word. And most importantly, go to that secret place Jesus described, close the door, and have an honest conversation with your Father about where your treasure is stored and which master truly owns your heart. The revolution of hidden righteousness, the prayer that reorders reality, and the treasure principle that determines destiny. These aren't just teachings from 2,000 years ago. They're the blueprint for authentic Christianity that still works today. The question is, will you live by it?